You have more than one chance to take the LSAT. And the fact that the LSAT is offered 8 times a year is a massive opportunity. Today, I'm going to share with you what I would personally do if I wanted to score a 175 or above on the LSAT in November, January, or beyond. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. Now, the LSAT has gone from being offered 4 times a year to now being offered 8 times a year. And so what this means is that there's never more than a month or two between LSAT test dates. This year alone, the LSAT is offered coming up August, September, October, and November. You could take any of those four, and in fact, you could take all of those four and apply to law school this cycle. The November LSAT is not too late. The January LSAT is also not too late. Of course, all else being equal, it's better to apply to law school earlier rather than later, but all else is rarely equal. Now, you've got a couple months till the November LSAT, plenty of time to get a top score if you put in the work, especially if you're not brand new to studying for the LSAT. Now, let's say you weren't sure whether taking the LSAT in November would give you enough time to reach your fullest potential. You could go on and take the January LSAT as well, or at least sign up for it. I would recommend taking the next couple weeks to solidify your foundation, then quickly switch gears to work on individual timed sections, and then full-length timed practice tests in the lead up to the November LSAT. And hopefully, of course, you can knock it out in November. But let's say hypothetically, November didn't give you enough time and you wanted 2 additional months to study for the LSAT. You wanted to have, say, winter break, for example, over the holidays to study. You could give yourself those additional 2 months, just taking 1 practice test a week, reviewing it in depth. That alone might be sufficient as your retake prep. So let's say that your PT average, your practice test average going into the November LSAT was a 172. That's a great practice test average, of course, and maybe you get lucky and score 175, or maybe you score just on target with the 172, or maybe you drop a couple points below your PT average. I would recommend, of course, whatever the outcome, if you don't score above your PT average on the November LSAT, I would recommend going for January, because through luck alone, you could do a few points better. And if you actually study significantly over those additional 2 months, you're maximizing your likelihood of scoring at least a couple points better on the January LSAT. Now, I don't think students out there realize what a massive opportunity you have, given that Logic Games is no longer on the test. There is now less material for you to study. Rather than 3 different sections, games, reasoning, and reading comp, you now have only 2 sections, logical reasoning and reading comp. LSAC has removed the Logic Games section and replaced it with a second scored logical reasoning section, which means you can narrow your focus, double up your attention devoted to the logical reasoning section, and any gains you make in your understanding of logical reasoning will be doubled across those 2 sections of the test. So I recommend, if you're taking the LSAT going forward, devote at least 2/3 of your LSAT study time to logical reasoning. There are approximately 15 different types of logical reasoning questions, but not all of them show up as frequently as others. The most common types are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. I would recommend, first and foremost, you master those types before moving on to relatively less common types like strengthen, weaken, and the least common types like parallel reasoning and evaluate the argument. You don't want to waste your LSAT prep time on the rare types that hardly ever show up if you haven't even mastered the most common types. You want to consider this when you're creating your LSAT study plan. And if you don't have an LSAT study plan, I recommend creating one, because LSAT prep is too important to be left to chance. It's too important to be left to the whims of however you're feeling that day. You want structure, you want accountability, you want motivation if you're going to put in the work necessary to achieve a top LSAT score, which is why at LSAT Unplugged, we create personalized day-by-day study plans for all of our students, whether you're in our small group program or in our one-on-one private coaching program. If you're interested in finding out more, you can check out the links below this video to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. Now, I mentioned those 3 common types of logical reasoning questions: necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. Those are the 3 most common question types, but I often find that students are under a number of common misconceptions regarding those question types, leading students to get a lower score than they otherwise should. In fact, oftentimes during our first coaching session with a student, we can correct some of these misconceptions, leading to a significant improvement in the student's performance on LSAT logical reasoning. So for example, there is oftentimes a major confusion around necessary assumption questions. there's an important distinction to draw between necessary assumption and sufficient assumption questions. They are asking for radically different things, but even some LSAT prep companies are confused about this, and they lump these two types under the catch-all category of quote-unquote assumption questions. So newsflash, there is no such thing as assumption questions on the LSAT. There are necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions, and they are asking you for very different things. The key to drawing a distinction between them is to understand the keyword or phrase differentiating them in the question stem. Necessary assumption questions will contain words and phrases synonymous with necessity, like depends upon, requires, and assumes. Sufficient assumption questions contain words and phrases synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, and properly inferred if assumed. So make sure that you're clear on this, as well as the other common types of logical reasoning questions, and you'll be well on your way to scoring a 175 or above. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.